Every now and then, you'll hear me say something. Now, this is one of the most important chapters in all the Bible. And when I say it, it really is. There are certain chapters that are just really, really stand out. Genesis 3, we looked at Genesis 3 is so very, very important because of the fall and what that means. But Genesis 12 is absolutely one of the most important chapters in the Bible because this is where God reveals himself to Abraham and calls Abraham. So Matt last week did a really great job of getting us up to this point. And at the end of chapter 11, we have now in one of the descendants of Noah, who of course is the descendant of Adam, is Terah. In verse 31, Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. All right, now look at this. So Terah, Abram's father, gets him and the clan and says, we're going to Canaan. Canaan, of course, is what we call Israel. It's the promised land. But when they come to Haran, which is not in Canaan, they don't get that far, they settled there. So Genesis 11, Genesis 1 through 11 is the first unit of Genesis. Of course, it's what is famously called by the liberals myth. I reject that. I believe in its absolute historicity. And it ends with, now we've got the descent from Adam to Abram is mentioned, but Abram is now, he's not in Canaan, and God is going to appear to him. And so Genesis 12 is the first time that God appears to Abram. And Abram becomes absolutely the most important person in the narrative. Until now, the narrative has been history, and it's been about all of humanity. But now it's going to become the story of one man and of that one man's descendants. It's a story of the world. It's the story of a race. Okay, now it becomes the story of a man and a family, and it's the family of Abram. And this man is separated from the rest to be God's universal channel of blessing. So it is through Abram that God's going to bless the world. So this is significant. First of all, we've got to just stop and admit here that this highlights the sovereignty of God. Because what did Abram do to be chosen of God? What did he do? Absolutely nothing. Why did God choose Abram and not somebody else? When you get to heaven, you ask. Because there's nothing about Abram that's any better than anyone else. So here you have, the story of salvation is of necessity a story of the sovereignty of God. That God sovereignly chooses Abram. Out of all the families of the world, he chooses this family. Out of all the people of the world, he chooses this man. And so Abram becomes the channel through whom God's going to bless all the world. And that Abram is chosen is an act of God's grace. Now, you cannot in any way argue that Abram chooses God. Now, he does choose God, but he chooses God in response to God's act. God initiates, Abram responds. And this is the pattern you see in all the scripture. You don't see anybody seeking God. You see God seeking people. And then when God initiates, they respond. But remember, God's under no obligation to save anybody. He's under no obligation to reveal himself to anybody. He's declared his glory in the heavens, and that glory is sufficient to reveal that he exists, but it's not sufficient to save. There has to be a revelation of God and of his grace for anyone to be saved. And there is no one that illustrates that more than Abram. And we call Abram the father of faith. The Bible calls him the father of faith, and so he is. Abram is not zapped. He responds to God's grace. He doesn't initiate, but he does respond. He's not an automaton. He's not a robot. He is a man with a will, and when God appears to him, God moves on his will, and Abram responds to him. So you see different characteristics associated with different Bible characters. With Moses, we associate the grace of meekness. With Samuel, integrity. With Elijah, courage. With Job, patience. With Daniel, faithfulness. With John, love. With Abram, it's faith. Faith and obedience. He believes God, and then that belief eventually, not always at first, but eventually causes him to respond in obedience. Now let's talk about Abram's faith and obedience, because I told you this is such an important chapter because it's mentioned so many other places. Hebrews chapter 11, which is a summary of those heroes of faith. Abraham gets a lot of ink in Hebrews 11, and it talks about him going to a place that God would show him. So God doesn't even initially tell Abram where he wants him to go. He just says, I want you to go to a land that I will show you. So he believed God when he did not know where God would lead him. He believed God when he didn't know how. God gave him a promise that he and Sarah would have a son long after they were past the age of having children. And yet he believed God. He believed God when he did not know why. When God required him to offer Isaac. That makes absolutely no sense. God never asked for human sacrifice. It seemed to be completely against everything Abram knew about God. And yet God says, I want you to offer your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. And Abram has to believe God without knowing why. So he doesn't know where, he doesn't know how, he doesn't know why, he doesn't know when, really. God tells him that he will give him a son, but he doesn't tell him when. So what you see beginning in Genesis 12 is a relationship between God and Abraham. 3 times the scripture calls Abraham the friend of God. He's called that in 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse 7, in Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 8, and in James chapter 2 and verse 23. 3 times he's called the friend of God. And through faith, we are linked with God, as was Abraham. Jesus refers to Abraham as father. And remember when Lazarus dies, where does the angel take him? To the bosom of Abraham. In other words, he sits at the table in the place of honor, which is where? Right beside Abraham. So Abraham is the father of faith. And he's the friend of God. He's the founder of the Jewish nation. The Jews are considered the sons of Abraham, and Paul calls him in Romans 4:16 the father of all who believe. So he's the father of all believers. He's the father of faith. So Abraham is such an important character. Just to give you sort of a bit of chronology, we don't really meet him till he's 75 years old. In verse 4 of chapter 12, we're told he's 75 years old when he enters Canaan. His son Ishmael is going to be born 11 years after that. So he's 86 when Ishmael is born. And Isaac is born 14 years after Ishmael. So Abraham is 100 years old when Isaac is born. And he lives 75 years after the birth of Isaac. So he lives to be 175, which is quite old. Remember, God has limited the lifespan of humanity after the flood, but he allows Abraham to live a long time. Now, in Genesis, there are 14 chapters that deal with Abraham. And what's significant about them is there are 8 theophanies. Theophany is just a big word that means an appearance of God. All right? So there are 8 times in these 14 chapters that God appears to Abraham. And they are always instructive. And each time, God is revealing something more about himself to Abram. And he brings Abram to a fuller knowledge of him. Now, between these theophanies, sometimes Abram, he gets into sin. He falls into, there's some type of a sin or a departure. And whenever he does that, he gets off track. And God has to graciously work in his life to bring him back. So God's dealing with Abraham is illustrative of the way that he deals with us. He reveals himself to us. How does God reveal himself to us? Through his word. But, whenever we don't obey God's instruction, we're not in the word. And really, God doesn't give us any new knowledge of himself until we come back to the place where we stepped out of the will of God. And you see that illustrated in the life of Abraham. Let's read the beginning in verse 1 of chapter 12. Here's the first of the 8 theophanies. The second one will be in verse 7. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the world shall be blessed, of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions that they had gathered and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land on the place to Shechem, to the oak or the terebinth of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. All right, a few things to point out here. First of all, this call is to Abram alone. God doesn't appear to his family, doesn't appear to his father, he doesn't appear to Sarah or to Lot. He appears to Abram, and he says, "I want you to go to a land that I will show you." And notice the triplet. I want you to see in verse 1. Go from your country, from your kindred, from your father's house. You notice how that narrows down from your country, your kindred, your father's house. This reflects, I think, or anticipates the triplet we're going to see when we get over to chapter 22, when God requires of Abram or to offer his son Isaac. And he says, offer your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. And you see that triplet. And each time it gets more focused. And here's God is telling Abram what to leave. And he gives him that focus. Go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, to the land I will show you. In chapter 22, your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. And he narrows it down. God's will is very, very specific for him. And instead of going where God called him in chapter 11, his father had stopped in Haran, but now God says, no, I want you to go all the way to Canaan. And, if we don't render obedience to God's command, God won't say anything further until we obey that command. You're not going to learn more about the Lord while you're in disobedience. God's only going to reveal himself to you. Even the word of God will be lifeless and dull to you when you're in disobedience to the Lord. God's just not going to show you anything new and exciting. He's not going to reveal himself to you when you're in disobedience. You've got to be obedient to what God has shown you, what he has told you to do, for you to then get fresh knowledge of God. There's just no substitute for obedience. So God's patience waited for his chosen man to obey him. And God's command is accompanied by promises rather than by reasons. I want you to see, God doesn't say, here's why I want you to go to Canaan. God doesn't give him the why. He just says, I want you to go. I want you to go to a land that I will show you. And here's what I'm going to do for you if you obey me. But God doesn't give him any reasons. He just gives him promises. The other thing I would point out to you is that, remember, beginning with Genesis 3, what does God give to humanity? Mostly curses. There's a curse on the human race. There's a curse on Adam. There's a curse on Eve, the woman. There's a curse on the serpent. There's a curse on humanity. God is sorry that he made man in the flood. He does give the promise in the rainbow, but who's the promise to? It's not to us, it's to himself. Remember, God puts the rainbow there to remind him of his promise. And there's been curses. The curse of Ham after the flood because of Noah's sin. So you see curses, 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 and all because of man's disobedience. What you do not see here is blessing because of man's obedience. You just see God's unilateral promise, I'm going to bless you. Now obey me. So the pattern in Genesis really flips here in chapter 12. We go from the curses of God on humanity because of sin and disobedience to God saying, okay, the only way that I'm going to be able to bless man is if I just sovereignly do this and of my grace. And so he chooses Abram and he promises him. He does not reason with him. He says, here's what I want you to do. Now do it. And 3 promises are attached to the command. First one is, I will make of you a great nation. Now what is it that God has asked Abram to leave? Leave his country. I'll make of you a great nation to compensate for the one you're giving up. Secondly, heaven's blessings will be upon him personally to compensate him for the loss of his kindred. He's leaving his kindred. So God's going to bless him personally. And for the loss of his father's house, God's going to make him the founder of the house of Israel. He's going to be the father of a great nation. He's going to have a son. So when God calls Abram to leave these things, your country and your kindred and your father's house, he's going to give him a new country and a new kindred and a new family and make him the father of a great family. Now these blessings are primarily material here, but God promises spiritual blessings also. So this first theophany is God's unilateral promise. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to curse those who dishonor you. I have chosen you, but I want you to obey me. I want you to do what I tell you to do. And so Abram, he does. He takes Lot, he takes Sarah, he takes his servants, and he goes. Verse 7 now is the second of the theophanies. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. Now, here you see him arriving in the land where God has called him. And so God honors him now. He's been obedient to the Lord. He's left Haran. He's come to the land of Canaan. He gets here to, there's a hill that's very evident there in northern Israel called the Hill of Moreh. And there's a big, it's often translated oak. It's really a terebinth. And there's a terebinth tree on the Hill of Moreh. And when Abraham gets there, God appears to him a second time. And he gives him another promise. He says, to your offspring, I will give this land. Now, it's important that we understand God's promise to Abram is that he's going to bless him. How? Through his offspring. I want you to keep your finger here, but turn over to Acts chapter 7. And if you remember the book of Acts, you remember that chapter 7 is one of the, I think it's, might be the longest sermon in the Bible. No, it wouldn't be as long as the Sermon on the Mount. I take that back. But it's one of the longer sermons, and this is the sermon of Stephen. And look how he begins it. He begins by talking about Abraham. So here's Stephen, who's giving a defense of Jesus as the Messiah. And he begins by talking about Abraham. The God of glory, is in verse 2, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran, and said to him, go out from your land and from your kindred and go into the land that I will show you. Then he went out from the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. And after his father died, God removed him from there into this land in which you are now living. Yet he gave him no inheritance in it, not even a foot's length, but promised to give it to him as a possession and to his offspring after him, though he had no child. So here's Stephen's beginning the story of Jesus with the story of Abraham. He's speaking to his Jewish brothers, and he's pointing out to them, now look, God made this promise to Abraham that he was going to give him this land that you're standing in right now, but he never did. He didn't get so much as one single foot of this land because he promised to give it to him through his offspring. And where Stephen's going to go with this argument is that Jesus is ultimately the offspring of Abraham. That it's not just about the physical descendants, it's about Jesus, his greater son, greater than Isaac, and that's where Stephen's going to go with this. So I want you to see, again, this is why I say Genesis 12 is so important. The way it figures into the gospel is that when they preach in the book of Acts and they tell the story of Jesus, they've got to begin with the story of Abraham, because how is it that God's going to bless all the nations of the world through Abraham? He's going to bring the Messiah through Abraham. These promises that are made to Abraham are not really about merely that land of Canaan being his. It's about the whole world. And the world is going to be his through the Messiah. And so this is the promise. And so the Lord in his second appearance, the second theophany, he says, I'm going to give this to your offspring. So look at the three ways that Abram responds. He built there an altar, he pitched his tent, and he called upon the name of the Lord. Now, all three of these things are a testimony. First of all, he builds his altar, testifying to the Canaanites that he worshiped the true God. He pitched his tent, declaring that he had no continuing city here on earth. This is what Hebrews 11 says. If you look at Hebrews 11, verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them from afar off. Because why? They were looking for a city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So when Abram pitches his tent here, he says, I'm not going back to Haran. I'm not going back to the land of my father. This is my land. I'm pitching my tent here. God has given me this land. And he called upon the name of the Lord, showing his reliance upon God for protection from his enemies. And by the way, again, here you have the name of Yahweh. He calls upon the name of Yahweh. So he alone is worshiping Yahweh. There is no one else worshiping Yahweh. This is absolutely remarkable, because all these other Canaanites are, and by the way, look at end of verse 6. Well, in verse 6, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the Tabernath of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Why is that little detail there? At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The author is saying to us, remember what I've told you, this is the technique a director uses. The woman, she's peeling potatoes or whatever, sets down the knife, and the camera zooms in on the knife and goes, oh, and she walks in the other room and she hears the noise, and you see the camera on the knife, and the director's telling you that knife's coming back into the story. And you sort of figure out, what's going to happen with that knife. Well, look what the writer's doing here. Oh, there were Canaanites in the land then. We're already being tipped off. So God's given this land to Abram and to his offspring, but there are Canaanites in the land. It's the land of Canaan. It makes sense that there are Canaanites there. I mean, where else would they be? Right? But we're being tipped off. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be kingdoms in conflict. Excuse me. The kingdom of God, represented by Abram. The kingdom of this world, represented by the Canaanites. And it's all about who gets dominion of this land. So we're being tipped off. Abram gets there, and he, in testimony to the Canaanites, builds an altar, pitches his tent, calls upon the name of the Lord. He declares himself. He's following God. Now, by the way, you go there. In just a very few weeks, some of you here will be going with me, and we're going to be there at Megiddo. You'll be able to see the hill of Moreh from right there. And one of the things that you have at Megiddo, there are multiple levels at Megiddo, and the Canaanite level of Megiddo, there's a big altar there. And they found the skeletons or the remains of children there at that altar. Now, what does that tell you? They're killing children. They're offering their children to their pagan gods. And the statuary that you find is pornographic, exaggerated genitalia, all that which you find really the world over. And in the middle of this, these religions that glorify sex and fertility cults and pornography, and that are killing their children. And here comes this guy named Abram, and he worships a God named Yahweh, whose primary characteristic is that he is what? He's holy. He's holy. That is unique He's the only monotheist. They all have multiple gods, and none of their gods are holy. Their gods are, we would consider them quite, well, the word is pagan, and that fits on every way. And Abram is just totally distinct. And so when he builds an altar, pitches his tent, calls upon the name of Yahweh, this is a declaration that I am completely different from you. God has given me this land, but notice Abram's not just going around telling everybody to move out. He's trusting the Lord and his timing to give it to him. And worship, pilgrimage, prayer are distinctive marks of all who are looking for that city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And so now, man, Abram's ready for God to move, right? Well, he ought to be, but now here's the first of the, let's call them deflections or departures, where Abram gets off the path. And it says in verse 10, there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. All right, now I've got to stop here and say, if you've not read the rest of the book, this may not trigger anything. But if you've read the rest of the book of Genesis, especially into Exodus, you read this and you go, wait, that's going to happen again. And that's exactly right. So what's going to happen? How do the Israelites end up getting down in Egypt? Because later in the book, there's going to be another famine, and Jacob and his sons are going to go down there. Joseph, of course, already down there. And the famine is going to drive them down into Egypt. And there in Egypt, they're going to be enslaved and until God sends plagues, and then Pharaoh kicks them out. Now, I want you to look at these verses. I want you to see how this little vignette here, this story of Abram going down into Egypt, foreshadows what's coming later in the book. I don't know if you've ever read The Grapes of Wrath, but one of Steinbeck's techniques in The Grapes of Wrath is he had these little chapters. He called them intercalary chapters. So in between the story of the Jodes and going through the Dust Bowl and all that, he would have a little chapter. And the one I remember is there's just a chapter, it's like a page and a half, describing a turtle crossing the road and getting hit by a truck. And you read that and you go, why is Steinbeck telling us the story of this little turtle in the road getting hit by a truck? Because that's foreshadowing what's going to happen to Tom Joad later in the story, right? I mean, this tragedy, and it's like, here's this one little creature in the middle of this great big highway, and he is helpless in the face of the machinery that's going to destroy him. That's exactly what's happening in the larger story. So this is exactly what you see in the book of Genesis. That here we have the story of Abraham taking Sarah, going down there into Egypt, and the key words in there, words like famine and Pharaoh. This is on over when Egypt's mentioned again later, prior to the story of Joseph, and he's not called Pharaoh again. But here, use Pharaoh, the word famine. Now, to be fair, in Hebrew, it's a different word for plague. It's a different word for plague than is used in Exodus, but they're synonyms. But you got all this foreshadowing of this is exactly what's going to happen. Israel's going to be taken down there, and like Sarah, who is taken by Pharaoh into his harem, Israel's going to be taken by Pharaoh to become slaves and servants of his. So let's read this in verse 10. Now there was famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, I know that you're a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake." Now, a couple things I want to point out. One, step outside of the story here for just a moment. Again, here's a little bit of foreshadowing, because on over in Exodus chapter 1, when, remember, the Israelites are now like they're slaves in Egypt, and they're growing too much. Their population's growing too much, that Pharaoh says, if there's a girl born, let her live, but if there's a boy, put him to death. And look right here what you've got. Here's Abram saying, hey, they'll kill me, but they'll let you live. And again, you've got a foreshadowing of what's going to happen on over in Exodus chapter 1. That aside, the literary device that Moses is using here, man, can you imagine anything more despicable for a husband to do than this? This is disgusting. Hey, I am willing to let Pharaoh have his way with you to save my hide. Man, that's pretty sad. I want you to see that this great hero of faith has great flaws. And so he says to Sarah, now, we do learn on over here in just a few chapters that Sarah is indeed his half-sister. But she's his whole wife. And he's willing to fudge the truth. The bottom line is he's a coward, and he's willing to count his wife as expendable. Now, you need to know that not only in the ancient world, across all cultures, the protection of the seed, protection of descendants, of heirs, is paramount. And this is why men were historically sort of allowed to cheat, if you will, in most cultures, but women were not. I mean, if you read anything about like Greek history, the men were into all kinds of sexual deviance with children and other men and everything else, but the women were not allowed to stray one bit. Why? Because a woman, they wanted to make sure that they knew exactly who the father was, so that you protect the family line. And that was pretty much true across all ancient cultures. So the point here is that even a pagan wouldn't do what Abram is doing here. Even a pagan would not allow his wife to ever be put in the position of having to have sex with another man. And this should be particularly true with Abram, because what is it that God has promised him? He's promised him a son. He's promised him a son specifically through Sarah. And he says, if he's willing to let that be called into question, the veracity of God's promise, in order to save his own skin. So here we've just seen him trust God with the spiritual things. He builds an altar, he pitches a tent, he calls on the name of the Lord. But he's not trusting God with the physical things, namely his life and his wife. And he says, hey, let's just say you're my sister, because they'll kill me. And indeed, they get there, and Sarah is a beautiful woman. And the Pharaoh's servants see her. Hey, man, there's this good-looking woman that came into town. No doubt you want her for your harem. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house at the end of verse 15. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. The implication being that either Pharaoh gives him some of this wealth, or at the very least allows him to have this wealth. he doesn't take other stuff away from him because he gets his sister. So it's like something of a political alliance. And here's Abram profiting not from God's promise to him, but from his own cowardice and conniving. And this is terribly unseemly. And this is not befitting the man whom God has chosen. So what does the Lord do? Verse 17, the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues. There's the word, because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. And literally in Hebrew, it doesn't even say her. It just says take and go. Take and get. And Pharaoh is done with him. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. You know, all the time spent out of fellowship with God is lost time. And Abram has not trusted God. He's not been obedient to God in this. And so what's he got to do? Man, he's got to go back to the place where he was walking with God. See, he didn't trust God with the famine, and he didn't trust God with Sarah. He didn't trust God with his life. He took all these matters into his own hands. So now he's got to go back to the place where he departed. Verse 1 of chapter 13. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. Now, the Negev is that desert at the south of Israel. It's where war between Israel and Egypt has always been fought. It's sort of the wilderness there, where Israel later will come up through that. So, but it's the southern part of the promised land. Abram leaves Egypt, comes into the Negev. Verse 2, Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel. Now that's interesting. You know what Bethel means? The house of God. That's all it means. Bethlehem means the house. Beth is the house. So Bethlehem, the house of bread. Bethel, this is the house of God. And so here, what a picture. He's got to leave Egypt. Egypt is always a picture of the world power, the powers of this age. He has to leave that. He can't trust in Egypt to save him. Where does he have to go? He has to meet with God. He has to go to the house of God, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there, Abram called upon the name of the Lord. See, a backslider gets right with God at exactly the place where he went wrong. What an encouragement to our hearts that, there's always a way back. There's always a way back. Recently, I was meeting with someone that I love very dearly who's just in sin. He's just rebelled against God, and he's gone against everything he's believed and taught. And everything in me wanted to just go there and just clean his clock and just say, man, what on earth are you doing? But what I did was I just tried to appeal to him, man, there's a way back. There's a way back. You know, you made some awful decisions here. And if you persist in this road, it's going to be worse. Your life's going to be an absolute mess. But the good news is there's a way back for you. Go back to the place where you built the altar. Go back to the house of God. Go back to the place where you called upon the name of the Lord. Repent. Return. There's a way back. And man, aren't you grateful that the blood of Jesus Christ is greater than our sin? That there's always a way back when you've blown it, when you've made such a mess of things, when you've really brought shame on yourself. I mean, what Abram has done here is tawdry and shameful and cowardly, and yet there's a way back from that. He has to return where he can meet with God again. And man, that's the freshness in our lives with God that we need, that we want. If you've departed from the Lord, ask yourself, where did I get off track in my marriage? Where did things go bad? Where did we start dishonoring each other, dishonoring the Lord? In my testimony at work, in my service to the Lord at church, where's the place where I got off track? And go back there, meet with the Lord again, and say, Lord, I want to serve and honor you. I want to call upon your name once again. And this is what we see in Abram. Abram, whom God will later rename as Abraham. Abram means father of many, but Abraham means father of a multitude. And God's going to change his name to father of a multitude. But before he can see God's promise fulfilled, he has to be obedient to the Lord in what God has shown him now. Before he can get further revelation, before he can see God again, he's got to be obedient to what is God's last instruction to me. I've got to do that. And here's where he comes. Man, this is my prayer for my own life. This is my prayer for you. This is my prayer for our church, that we'll always be sensitive to the Lord, that he'll chastise us before we go too far, that we'll always come back and say, Lord, I want to meet with you again. Let's just bow before him right now. And let's just ask him to help us have that freshness in our walk with him. Father, I pray that we might follow this example and know that even when we've blown it, when we've made terrible mistakes, when we've brought shame and reproach upon your name or even upon your church, that there's a way back, that we can yet again meet with you. Can't expect to hear a fresh word from you until we've been obedient to what you've shown us in the past. So Lord, we want to be faithful. May we, like Abraham, always meet with you through the altar, the place of sacrifice, the shed blood of Jesus Christ. May we pitch our tent, realizing that this world is not our home, that we really are citizens of a heavenly city, and may we call upon your name, our personal God, our God who has revealed himself through his Son, Jesus Christ, and through the written word that tells us of him. And Lord, may we meet with you in the pages of your book. And may our hearts stay tender to your leading, sensitive to sin, always inclined to return to you at the first evidence that we've stepped out of your will. Make it so for your honor and glory. We pray in the name of Jesus, our Savior. Amen.